So, what I want to talk about now is social stratification in industrial societies. So, we're going to set aside stratification systems that existed before the emergence of industrialism in the 1700s into the early 1800s, and look at systems that kind of came into place as we transitioned away from a medieval or feudal society into an industrial capitalist system. And there are two broad ways to look at stratification in industrial society. So, certainly post 1750, 1800. The first is something that I think most people are fairly familiar with, which is sort of conventional or um, um, functional views. Well, let's stick with conventional views of social class. What most people in the United States, when they are asked about social class or when they think about social class, what they think of, and that is a group of people who share a similar position economically within society, so a similar socioeconomic status. So when most people in the United States think about social class, they think about upper class, middle class, working class, lower class. Um, some people make finer distinctions, right? There's no dogmatically correct answer to the question, how many social classes are there in the United States? Some people differentiate, say, for example, middle class from the upper middle class or the lower middle class. Um, I don't think that there's anything, sort of objectively wrong with that, but I'm just going to kind of keep it as simple and straightforward as possible and talk about upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class. Sometimes people also will say the poor, or they might say the underclass to refer to those people at the bottom of the social class structure. Again, I think that all of those labels are perfectly okay. Um, so let's start with the lower class, or the poor, or the underclass. This is, of course, the people who are at the bottom of the social class structure. These are people who are unemployed, or maybe only seasonally employed. Sometimes um, they're working less than full time, right? They're earning the minimum wage or very, very close to the minimum wage, right? So those would be the people who kind of make up the vast lower class or the underclass in a given um, industrial society. Working class is a little bit different. The working class refers to people who work in factory jobs, in clerical jobs, in low-paying sales jobs. So generally speaking, the thing that differentiates working class occupations from middle class occupations is often income, but more often than income, the principal difference is skill. All right, so most working class occupations don't require highly skilled workers. And the workers who do possess high levels of specialized skill, those specialized skills are typically acquired on the job. So you don't go to college and study how to work on an assembly line, even though sometimes the assembly work can be uh, um, quite demanding. It can require a high level of skill in that particular kind of work. Those skills are going to be acquired on the job. Um, so highly skilled working class occupations, electrician, plumber, things like that, often those people do end up getting professional credentialing, but it isn't necessarily required. Um, but that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? Because you can have somebody who is a working class person, a household where that family is very much in the working class, and they might make as much money or even sometimes a little bit more money than people who are in the middle class, because some working class occupations pay quite well. Most don't, but some do. So the big differentiator between the working class and the middle class often comes down to whether or not you are in a blue collar occupation or a white collar occupation, whether the job you have requires skills that you learn on the job or skills that you had to acquire in pursuit of a formal education post-secondary, so college, some degree of college education. So the working class and the middle class are actually quite large, and that's really, really important because it is the middle class especially, but to a certain extent also the working class, who drive the economy. So in a capitalist economic system, the thing that drives economic activity is demand for goods and services, right? And then capitalists, the people who actually control the ability to produce those goods and services, will produce them. They'll risk some of their capital to create a product or to create a service that people will then consume. They're not going to create the product or the service unless there are people in the society in a position to purchase those goods or services. Because the purpose of economic activity in capitalism isn't to produce goods and services, it's to generate profit for capitalists. The byproduct of the generation of profit for capitalists is the creation and the provision of goods and services. But the reason why a capitalist makes shoes isn't because they want everybody in the society to have shoes on their feet, because feet should be protected from broken glass and cold, snowy slush or whatever. That's going to put money back in my pocket, right? I'm going to make more money. I'm already rich because I'm a capitalist. I want to get richer. I want more, right? So because the middle class, after they've paid for the essentials, they have discretionary income left over. They have extra money to go out there then and spend on goods and services that are being produced in significant quantities by the capitalist class. The working class does that too, to a certain extent, because the working class is often organizing their consumption around a kind of aspirational middle class set of goals and targets. They tend to want the same things and try to buy the same things as people in the middle class. The problem is that it's harder for them to do that because they make less money, so they have less money to spend on those things. But a really, really robust middle class combined with a large and relatively well compensated working class is actually the thing that's going to drive economic production, and especially on the middle class, it's going to drive the culture, right? The entertainment programming, the movies, the television shows, the music, the kinds of cars that get produced, the lifestyle dimensions of capitalism that get promoted through advertising and sales to the average consumer. Those are going to reflect the tastes and preferences of the middle class, both because the middle class is kind of creating a lot of that culture, but also because the upper class, the capitalist class, they're the ones that are trying to recoup the investment of their capital through appealing to the tastes and preferences of the middle class. Again, the group of people with the greatest amount of money to sort of allow them to do that. So that would be the importance of the middle class. And we can see the economic fortunes of the United States expanding and contracting with the relative health of the middle class and to a certain extent the working class. Those groups are large, but as those groups have more or less money to spend, we can see economic fortunes either improving overall in the United States or declining overall in the United States. So again, this is going to be a sort of an important way to analyze social class. And then, of course, you have the upper class. This is a small group. They occupy the highest levels of status, the highest levels of prestige. They have the greatest amount of wealth. They have the greatest amount of income. But because they are a really, really small group of people, they're not large enough in terms of numbers to compensate for a decline in the ability of the middle class, for example, to purchase goods and services. So as the ability of the middle class to buy goods and services declines, it isn't like the upper class just steps in and makes up for all of that. They still only need a couple of houses, or want a couple of houses. They probably, they'll buy a few cars, but they're not going to make up for all of the declining demand that's going to result from a weakening of the purchasing power of the middle class and to a certain extent the working class. So that's a conventional way to look at social class. I think that it's probably something that most people in this country are familiar with. There's a persistent sort of belief in the United States that we are not a class conscious society. I think that's largely inaccurate. We are a little bit circumspect in how we talk about social class. But one of the very first questions we ask somebody we meet for the first time, as we're introduced to them at a party or some other event, we ask them, after we ask them their name or we're introduced to them by name, we say, what do you do for a living? That is a class question, right? We're asking them in a very, very, very sort of disguised and polite way. We're asking them how much money they make, because we can take what we know about that particular occupation and we can derive from that a sense of the kind of lifestyle they live, right? What kind of social class position do they occupy, right? So we are class conscious. We try to pretend like we're not, for a variety of reasons. But I do think that irrespective of that, an ability to sort of look at social class through that lens of socioeconomic status is really, really helpful for some things. For other things, that's really not going to be very helpful. So for example, power, which is different from income and wealth and occupational prestige, it's not unconnected to those things, but it's different from those things. There really isn't, in that sort of socioeconomic status model of social class, there isn't really a way to look at the way that power operates. Now, power, just to give you a very, very quick sort of working definition, power consists of the ability to achieve goals over the objection of others, right? So power isn't the same thing as achieving, right? Although, sometimes the things you want to achieve will require an expenditure of power. Getting a good grade in this class is not an exercise in power. It's an exercise in hard work and skill and perseverance and to a certain extent smarts. But I'm not trying to stop you from getting an A. If I'm trying to stop you from getting an A and you still get one, that would be an exercise in power, because you're earning that credential or you're earning that grade over my efforts to keep you from achieving it. Right? But that's why that's not an exercise in power, because no one's trying to stop you from getting a good grade in this class or in any class, although sometimes it might feel like that's not the case, right? That the teacher may actually have it in for you. I promise you we don't, right? We're trying to make the class rigorous so that you learn something. All right, so how do we capture power in our models of social class if it's not going to be reflected in a model of social class built on socioeconomic status? For that, we use the Marxian view, or the conflict theory view of social class, which tells us that a social class is a group of people who share a position relative to the means of production. Now notice that's very different than a group of people who share a similar socioeconomic status, right? The relations of production or the means of production is just how we produce goods and services, right? So who owns or who controls the economic resources through which we generate goods and services? Your relationship to that system of production determines your degree of power, your degree of economic control within the society's economy. The most powerful class of people in a capitalist economy are the capitalists, because they own the property through which production of goods and services occurs. They imagine somebody owns a factory in central Illinois, and they decide that they want to move that factory to China, or They want to just close the factory down. They're done earning money. They've got as much as they want. They've decided that it's time for them to bring it all to an end. So they decide they're going to close their factory, go live on an island in the Caribbean somewhere. Even though that decision is going to result in the economic collapse of the small town where this factory is located. Because remember, in a single industry community, the largest industry moves out of that economy. All of the restaurants, all of the movie theaters, all of the clothing stores, all of the car dealerships, all of the gas stations, right? Those places were kept afloat by the paychecks that were being earned, at the local factory. Well, when the factory goes away, people don't have money anymore. So they're not going to go to the restaurants. They're not going to go to the movie house. They're not going to buy new clothes. They're not going to buy a new car. And all those other businesses are going to similarly start to contract. They'll have to lay off their workers. They'll have to reduce their inventories, right? And it creates a ripple effect throughout the entire economy. So when this factory closes, it isn't just the end of the factory. It's in essence the economic death of this small town. But that capitalist who owns that factory can do it because it belongs to that capitalist. There's no mechanism that says you have to build a factory here, and once you build this factory, you have to keep it here because all of these people depend on you. Your ownership of that means of production gives you the greatest degree of control over how those economic resources get utilized, right? If they're getting utilized to generate goods and services, it's because you want to do that. You are generating some kind of profit from that activity. But you're not obligated to do that as a capitalist. So it's a very small group of people, but they have tremendous power because they control the relations of production. They also have great wealth and income as a result of that too. But keep in mind, it isn't the income and wealth that gives them the power. It's the power that's giving them the income and wealth, because there are people in that society, in any society organized under capitalism, who might have a lot of money, but not a lot of power. So think of like, a really good example might be an elite athlete on a professional sports team. That elite athlete might make in a single year much more money than the coach or even the general manager of that team. But the general manager or the coach has more power. Now that power has been delegated by ownership to that position. It's not like, the general manager of the Chicago Cubs or the coach, the manager of the team. It's not like they own the Chicago Cubs. That team is owned mostly by the Ricketts family, but the Ricketts family has hired particular individuals and delegated to those individuals power over people who are paid a lot more money than they are, right? So you could take, say Jason Hayward, who is the right fielder for the Chicago Cubs, who makes a lot of money because of the nature of his contract. But if David Ross, who's the manager, the coach, if he decides that he wants to put Jason Hayward on the bench for a game, he can do that. Because, at the end of the day, even though Jason Hayward has a lot more money than David Ross has more power, right? And that's why it's a mistake to sometimes think that power and money are kind of the same. You can have money and really no power, but more often than not, what you have is a situation where power is going to get you more money. Like I said, sometimes power gets delegated. So like a manager or an entrepreneur might have some degree of either situational power, or in the case of entrepreneurs, some degree of autonomy. Like a creative person, for example, doesn't write music or create other pieces of art when the capitalist snaps their fingers. But if you've written a bunch of music and you want to get it to an audience to generate, revenue for you, a kind of income stream, you're going to need record producers. You're going to need a label to release and promote your material. You're going to need concert venues and promoters to kind of give you a space in which you can perform for audiences. And all of those resources are controlled by capitalists. So when we look at managers and entrepreneurs, especially in industrial capitalism, it's tempting sometimes to think that this is a group that kind of has power and autonomy on its own, but it's really just delegated to them. But once it is delegated to them, it does have some consequence. A CEO, even though they are not the owner of the company, a CEO can make very consequential decisions about the operation of the company, but that power can also be taken away, right? The board can fire a CEO, or the owners of a company can dismiss a CEO because at the end of the day, whatever power they have has just been delegated to them. So they'll have higher than average wages and salaries. They'll have some limited degree of power and control, but at the end of the day, they really are just workers, a slightly more advantageously positioned group of workers, but they are just workers. So, when Marx does his initial analysis, his initial critique of capitalism, he says, really, at the end of the day, there are really only two groups of people. There are the capitalists and there are the workers. Now, that may be a little bit of an oversimplification, not as much as some critics would like to believe. But again, a capitalist is the one who has the greatest amount of power. They can delegate some of that power to managers and entrepreneurs, but those managers and entrepreneurs are really just a particularly fancy kind of worker because they're just selling their labor power, which is what defines a worker as a worker, right? Somebody who sells their labor power to capitalists, right? So that the economic activity that generates profit through the production of goods and services can occur. There is another group of capitalists, what Marx would call the petite bourgeoisie, and this is a small group of people who own and control their own businesses, but they also do most of their own work. They don't buy a lot of labor power from other people. So this is actually a group of people that's still kind of hanging around even in the 21st century in the United States. So a small business owner might do a lot of the work of their small business. They might also hire some workers, but they also go to work each day and they're on the shop floor or they're in the place of business doing the work as well. Think of like a restaurant owner who also cooks or seats people at the restaurant, or so he or she might be doing a lot of the work involved with the business, and also be the owners. Most businesses in the United States, most of the economic activity that occurs in a situation where large corporations and firms are kind of the dominant players in that game. So the petite bourgeoisie are certainly still there, but and they are a particular kind of capitalist. But again, the capitalists, the big fish, so to speak, are the ones who are really calling the shots. Just like workers are the ones who are providing the vast majority of labor in exchange for relatively low wages and relatively low compensation, but some of them do get elevated to a position of management or oversight, or occupy sort of an entrepreneurial position within the system. So they're workers, but they're a particular kind of worker, and they're differentiated from the sort of rank and file workers in many important ways. So a social class analysis done through a Marxian perspective is going to reveal different things about the underlying operation of the economy than one predicated on looking at socioeconomic status. It's really important, just from a conceptual standpoint, an analytic standpoint, it's really, really important that we have both of these tools in our pocket, because sometimes we're going to want to understand something that's a function of power, and we need a tool that allows us to understand how power operates. Other times we're going to want to understand how things operate in terms of consumption and the relative the relative size and composition of more conventional understandings of social class. And so having that socioeconomic status model is going to be very, very helpful for that. Last thing I wanted to say is something very, very quick about status, because we've been talking a lot about statuses in economic terms. And this is as good a place as any to sort of introduce a particular way of thinking about statuses. Statuses, generally speaking, can be either ascribed or achieved. Again, this is a Soc 101 kind of thing, but it's probably never a bad idea to be reminded of it. An ascribed status is one that is imposed on you, right? It's a characteristic or a status that's determined by birth, right? So race, sex, who your parents are, right? Something like that. So if you have a brother or a sister, that your status as a sibling is a function of somebody else's activities, your parents specifically. They engaged in a set of decisions that resulted in you becoming a brother or a sister. That would be an ascribed status. An achieved status is one that you earn, right? So you do something or you accomplish something that brings you into that particular status. So you graduate from high school, you enroll in college, you become a college student. So college student is an achieved status, not an ascribed status. The reason this is important is that when we get into talking about racial caste, especially historical systems like chattel slavery in the British American colonies and then in the United States, those systems are often built on ascriptive characteristics, so skin color, parentage, right, place of origin, things of that nature. So it's really, really helpful to have both of those understandings of status kind of in your belt, right, in your conceptual toolkit, ready to go. So that should wrap us up for this one, and I will see you all next time.